How can we know that we are in the end time generation? Well, Christ said, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." That's Matthew 24, verse 14. Then shall the end come. In other words, the end time generation will begin when the Great Commission has been fulfilled. The preaching of the gospel to all nations can be called the Great Commission. But how do we know when the preaching of the gospel to all nations is complete? In other words, how can you gauge, how can you judge when the Great Commission has been fulfilled? Well, Christ gives us a sign we can use. He says the return of Israel is the sign that the Great Commission has been fulfilled. That's in Acts 1. In Acts 1, verse 6, Christ is about to ascend after the resurrection, 48 days after the resurrection. And the disciples come together and they ask him, "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" And we skip verse 7, which is the first part of his answer. We go straight into verse 8. He says, this is the condition that is required before Israel returns. Israel gets sovereignty, independence. The kingdom. "You shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you," and this is the punchline right here, "you shall be witnesses to me in Jerusalem, in Judea and Samaria, and to the end of the earth." In other words, the Great Commission has to be fulfilled before Christ will restore the kingdom to Israel. Did you catch that? They ask him, "Will you do it now?" And he goes beyond that. He answers the question as though they had asked him, "If not now, when?" That's the question he answers. When will you restore the kingdom? He says in verse 8, Acts chapter 1, verse 8, "You must go to Jerusalem, to Judea, to Samaria, to the ends of the earth, and fulfill the Great Commission, and then the kingdom will be restored to Israel." So the restoring of the kingdom to Israel, in other words, the return of Israel as an independent nation, that is a sign that the Great Commission has been fulfilled. And number two, the fulfilling of the Great Commission is the sign that the end time generation has begun. Because, let me say it again, Matthew 24, verse 14, "The gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness to all nations, and then shall the end come." Then shall the end time generation come, is one way you can interpret it. And now, if we interpret the return of Israel as the beginning of the end time generation, then that means we take 1948 and we add 40 years to it. Well, that brings us to 1988. It did not work. 1948 plus 70 brings us to 2018. That did not work. But if we use the, you take 1948 and then you tweak it to 1950, and then you add 70, that would bring us to this year. Could this year be the end of the end time generation? Yes, the evidence is quite strong. But let me touch on this this change from 1948 to 1950. You see, in 1950, the Supreme Court of the new state of Israel and the Knesset, they both ruled that the Samaritans are to be accepted as Jews, the equivalent of Jews. And the Samaritans were the remnant of the northern kingdom. So that means the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom and the 2 tribes of the southern kingdom, which is the Jews and the Benjaminites. It makes 12 tribes. So the 12-tribe nation, the full Israel, came when that reconciliation became was manifested, when it went into effect. That means 1950. And see, the Israel of 1948 was not the 12 tribes Israel. It was the 2 tribes, Judah and the Benjaminites. But in 1950, combining the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, that's the joining of the 2 sticks, which was prophesied in Ezekiel 37 and 37, verse 16 through 22. And the 2 sticks are the 2 nations, the north and the south. And so in 1950, we have the real Israel. And so we use that as a starting point of the end time generation. And so you add 70 years because of, that's what's stated in Psalm 90, verse 10. It says 70 years is a generation. And so that brings us to 2020. And so 2020 really should be the year of the rapture, which occurs when Russia bombs America. And, well, North Korea will bomb South Korea, I expect. And so the rapture will extend from one horizon to the other horizon. In other words, America is on the, let's say, the eastern side of the world, and Korea is on the opposite side, let's say the west side. And so those 2 poles are 2 endpoints. And so the rapture would extend from Korea to America, but it would not include every place in between. And the rapture will be very limited. And now let me see. Well, the tribulation, that's the time that Russia rules the world. That will be 5 months. That's in Revelation 9, verse 5 and 10. And then Christ comes and takes away Russia's victory. And that'll be at Purim. Gorbachev will die at the same time that Haman died, which is Purim. Look in the book of Esther, chapters 9 and 10, for an explanation about Purim. Oh, yes. In order for 2020 to be the year of the completion of the 70-year generation, that Christ spoke about in Luke 21, verse 32. He says, this generation will not end before all things are fulfilled. Now there's two sets of events. One set of events was fulfilled one generation from the time that Christ was crucified. He was crucified in 30 A.D., according to a little booklet named Are the New Testament Documents Accurate? It's by F. Bruce. He was a very well-reputed Bible scholar. F. Bruce. It says 30 A.D. It explains. It's not 31. It's not 33. It's 30 A.D. And then you add 40. It brings us to 70 A.D. And that generation, the events, was fulfilled by 70 A.D. Then another set of events is in Luke 21, and this set of events is the end time events, and they begin with the return of Israel. I tried to explain that already, and then they get fulfilled, or they finish 70 years later, which brings us to 2020. Now, in order for this to be true, we cannot have a 7-year trib, because the 7-year trib would have already begun 7 years ago, which would be 2013. And it did not happen. And that's because the 7-year trib idea is false. The trib will not be 7 years. It will be 5 months. Christ, in Matthew 24, he takes the tribulation of those days, which is in verse 29. And that's talking about the tribulation of the Roman-Jewish war, the siege of Jerusalem. It lasted 5 months. And Christ says the end time trib, he puts that immediately after the tribulation of those days. And the end time trib begins with the stars falling. And so when Christ says the stars will fall immediately after the tribulation of those days, he's talking about the end time trib coming immediately after the tribulation of 70 A.D. Now, that's not literally true. So it must be true in some non-literal sense. It's true in the sense that we voluntarily take the end time trib and we put it next to the tribulation of 70 A.D. Now, why would Christ want us to do that? Well, the idea is that the tribulation of 70 A.D. was 5 months. So Christ is trying to get us to see the end time trib will be 5 months, just like the tribulation of those days. That's my explanation about why Christ would do something strange, like put the end time trib immediately after the tribulation of 70 A.D. Okay, I mentioned that nuclear war, Russian attack, is part of the end time. It's one of the end time events. Now, what evidence do I have to back that up? From Luke 21 or the equivalent in Matthew 24. Now in Matthew 24, at the beginning of the chapter, the disciples asked Christ, what is the sign of your coming, your return? Now in Luke, the disciples do not ask him that. In Luke, Christ gives them that information without them asking. And but my point is that the sign of his coming is given where he talks about the signs in the sky, the sun and the moon and the stars. These are signs of what? These are signs of his coming, signs of his return. And logically, well, his Christ's return, in other words, the second coming, is the purpose of the second coming is given in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. It's given in terms of defeating or destroying the man of sin, in other words, the Antichrist. So that's the coming of the Antichrist is the true sign of Christ's return. In other words, it's a sign that Christ's return is right around the corner. And the coming of the Antichrist, how does he come? He comes in Revelation 13:7. It says he takes over the world. How? By making war against the saints. In other words, against the countries predominantly Christian, because the word saint refers to Christian. It's a term that applies to all Christians. So when Christ speaks about the sun darkening and the moon darkening and the stars falling, we have to put that in the context or the category of the coming of the Antichrist. The Antichrist comes through launching nuclear war against the Christian countries. Well, historically, Europe was the continent that became the first Christian continent. And so the Christian countries, originally that meant the countries of Europe. Those are the countries that the Antichrist will attack. He'll overrun Western Europe, and, well, Eastern Europe will also be taken. Now, we're talking about Russia taking Europe, but because America is the defender of Europe, America also gets hit by Russia. Russia does not invade America like it invades Europe, but Russia bombs America. Now, I'm trying to set up give you the information where you can understand the sun darkening and the moon darkening and the stars falling. It's talking about nuclear war. Now, an easier way for me to do that is to refer you, instead of looking at Matthew 24, verse 29 and 30, I ask you to look at the book of Revelation, chapter 6, verse 12 and through 15. It's talking about the same signs, the sun and the moon darkening. It's more clear, it's more finished, more polished, more complete. It talks about, it gives you another sign. It says the sky will roll up like a scroll being rolled up. Now, how can that be talking about nuclear war? Well, instead of the sky being rolled up, think of the mushroom clouds rolling up. What happens is the nuclear fireballs, they cool into mushroom clouds, and the clouds roll outward. They don't roll up, but they roll out. And as they roll out, they become bigger, and they fade away. And the rolling action would be what Revelation 6 is talking about when it says that the rolling is like the rolling of a scroll. And so that's why I say this is talking about nuclear war. And, well, as far as Revelation 6 is concerned, it says the moon turns red. Now, that has been fulfilled several times whenever there's like a super volcano that fills the sky with soot and smoke, and that becomes a filter and makes this, when you look through the soot and the smoke, the moon looks red, and so the same would be true in nuclear war. The soot and the smoke would make the moon look red, and so you can see there is evidence in favor of what I'm saying. And as far as the sun turning black, that's in Revelation 6. The sun turning black, it's not the sun turning black. It's everything turning black for a split second. This is due to wave interference. And there was a movie on TV many years ago, and where they tried to duplicate or simulate a nuclear bomb exploding, and for a split second everything turned black. So that's what I would say is meant when it says the sun will turn black. And so that's enough for that. Now I wanted to go back over what I began with, the return of Israel as a sign that the Great Commission has been fulfilled. That's based on Christ answering the disciples. They ask him, will you now restore the kingdom to Israel? Now, the next question they should ask would be, if not now, when? And Christ actually answers that question. He tells them when it will be restored. In verse 8, he says, the Great Commission has to be fulfilled. So basically he's saying, you fulfill the Great Commission, and then the kingdom will be restored. Then Israel will return, the Jews will return, and Israel will become an independent country again. And so you can see that he is actually saying the return of Israel is the sign that the Great Commission has been fulfilled. And the Great Commission being fulfilled is a sign that we're in the end time generation. That's Matthew 24, verse 14. So I hope it makes sense to you. And thank you for watching my video. And I'm going to put a transcript in the description box.